Our scripture lesson for today comes out of Acts, the book of Acts, in the 8th chapter, and looking at the 26th through the 31st verse. And I'm going to use as a topic today, the difference of difference. The difference of difference. In Acts 8:26 through 31 says, "Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Get up and go towards the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road.' So he got up and he went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, 'Go over to this chariot and join it.' So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. And he asked, 'Do you understand what you are reading?' And he replied, 'How can I unless someone guides me?' And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him." I remember back in the days long ago when my job included doing a bit of programming. In one role, I worked as an NC programmer, a numerical control programmer. That is one who provides machining and programming technical expertise to support the design and the manufacture of parts. And it was fascinating to program something and then go down to the prototype center and watch the machines actually make something that was programmed with something that came out of my head. Or to program something in New Jersey and have it come out on a machine in Ohio or Louisiana. But if you've ever done any sort of programming, you might understand that there are oftentimes errors that'll block your program or make machines go in the wrong direction. You should have seen some of the turns the machines made when I didn't expect it to. Sometimes, no matter how many times you look at a code over and over, there's an error that continues to elude you. And after spending too much time troubleshooting, instead of starting a whole program over, it's sometimes helpful to have somebody else take a look at the code to see if they notice any problems. In most cases, the other person could come up and look to find the smallest thing that you didn't even see. It doesn't even have to be programming. The same thing can happen in the kitchen. How many times have you looked for that can of beans or that can of tomato sauce and you just couldn't find it? And you ask somebody to come help and come look for it, and they walked right up and grabbed the can right in front of you. I'm not a programmer anymore. I'm a project manager. And the other day, I noticed a quote by somebody on my team that someone on my team had. He had a quote by Ray Dalio, and it was at the bottom of his signature. And it said, "If you can look at things with the help of others who can see what you are blind to, you'll see much more than you can alone." It's interesting because this man was a data architect. So I know he had plenty of times where he knew that he had to call on somebody else to get some help to see what he couldn't see. Sometimes we get stuck in life. We've been trying to get something done and it's just not working. It can be a task at work. It could be something around the house. It can be a dream you've been trying to achieve, but just can't find a way to make it happen. We just can't figure out what's blocking us. Maybe there's something in your blind spot. A blind spot, that thing, that dangerous area while you're in your car where you can't see a vehicle it's not right behind you, but it's also not quite next to you. But it's close enough that if you make a wrong turn, you can run into it. There are some things in life that are like that. It may not be a car, but something in your life where you're right near your answer, but you just can't see it. That's the time when it might be helpful to get another pair of eyes on the matter, get another view. We just might achieve that goal. We might be able to make it happen if we reach out and get some help. Or we might even grow in a way as we go through the next step. We might grow in ways that we weren't looking for and we didn't even know to expect. The text for today gives us some guidance on how to open up to assistance and how to be open to someone else's opinion. The text comes out of the book of Acts. That second part of the work that we attribute to an author that we call Luke, but most scholars say it was actually anonymous. This person was educated and well-traveled, and it's thought that he converted to Judaism before becoming a Christian missionary. Apparently, the narrator was more focused on the story than on identifying himself. Acts is not a gospel like Luke, though. It doesn't tell the story of a heroic character. It's actually a sketch of the origins of a religious movement. It tells how the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, was spread. And that was a dangerous thing in that time. Because think about it, there were Pharisees such as Saul, who later became Paul, who had become persecuting the followers of Jesus. That was in addition to the persecution that came from the Jewish and Roman officials. It was this kind of environment, in that environment, that the story of a man referred to only as the Ethiopian eunuch takes place. A eunuch, as you know, was a man who had been castrated so that he could be trusted for the service in the royal household. They could be trusted with the harem or trusted with advising or serving the queen. In this case, the man in our story served as the one who took care of the treasury for a queen. In the text, it refers to that queen's name as Candace, but it also could be Candace is another term for queen. It's interesting to note that in the ancient kingdom of Kush, which is Ethiopia, it was ruled by warrior queens. So the man in this text was a pretty highly trusted official in Ethiopia. Now, before I go too far in the sermon, I must admit that one of the things that in this text gives me pause. I have a problem with it. And that is that throughout the scripture, they refer to the Ethiopian eunuch, not by a name, but by a label. That's like telling a story about me and only saying that black woman over and over again. Or even worse, if my spouse only referred to me as the wife over and over again. We like to use labels to identify things, but people are not things. They are human beings, flesh and blood and spirit. So referring to somebody by a label ignores or disrespects their personhood. I read somewhere, as a society, we should consider the fact that labels often warp our perceptions of people. In essence, they promote blatant and unconscious prejudice. Since I didn't want to move forward in this sermon referring to a person like he was an object, I searched as much as I could to find a name for this person they referred to as the Ethiopian eunuch. The best I could find was one source that said there was a Gnostic work from 180 AD that referred to someone similar in a story. So it's thought that it may be the same man, and that man's name was Simeon. Since that's the most likely name I could find, in an attempt not to repeat referring to him by a label, but rather affirm him as a person, for this sermon, I'm going to refer to the Ethiopian eunuch by the name of Simeon. As we look at the text, we find Simeon in his chariot on his way back home after going to Jerusalem to worship. It's thought that Simeon was a recent convert to Judaism who chose to go to Jerusalem as part of his quest as a seeker in his new religion. And while he was reading from the scroll, reading the words from the prophet Isaiah, the text says that Philip, who had been directed down the road by the Spirit, was also directed by the Spirit to go over to Simeon. And as he approached the chariot, he heard that Simeon was reading from the prophet Isaiah, and he asked him if he understood it. And Simeon replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And then he invited Philip to get into his chariot and sit beside him. And then Philip was able to explain the passage that Simeon was reading. You know, there are a few different ways to approach this text. There's a few questions that come up. Number one, was Philip being rude by asking Simeon if he knew what he was reading? Number two, why does the white guy always have to be the savior for the African? Number three, why did Simeon convert to Judaism in the first place? Those are good questions. They're reasonable things to ask when you read these texts, but it's not what I want to focus on for this message. For this message, I want to explore three different topics. Number one, the worth of worthiness. Number two, the difference of difference. And number three, letting the Spirit guide. In Simeon's day, from a Jewish perspective, he would have been considered unclean and he would have been excluded from worship. As found in Deuteronomy 23:1, which blatantly says no one who has been castrated is welcome into the assembly of the Lord. Perhaps that's why Simeon was trying to figure out the text on his own, because he would not have found cooperation with mentors or teachers in Jerusalem. But even though he was not welcome to worship in Jerusalem, Simeon wasn't going there as someone who was seeking acceptance. He was going there to worship the God of his understanding, the God he felt compelled to worship and to learn about. No matter what people thought about him, Simeon felt good enough about himself to know that he was worthy of a relationship with God. So he made it to Jerusalem, and on his way, he met Philip, someone who cared enough and was knowledgeable enough to explain Simeon's questions about his newfound faith. What I like about Simeon was he felt good enough himself to keep his mind focused on his goal. And that's probably why Simeon didn't trip when Philip asked him if he knew what he was reading. He was so secure in himself, he wasn't ashamed to admit that he needed some help. I'm reminded of some things I read in Psychology Today about people with a good balance between too much and too little self-worth. Those things include, they know the difference between confidence and arrogance. They're not afraid of feedback. They don't people please or seek approval. They're not afraid of conflict. They're able to set boundaries. They're able to voice their needs and their opinions. They're assertive, but not pushy. They're not a slave to perfection. They're not afraid of setbacks, and they don't fear failure. And they do not feel inferior. And most importantly, they accept who they are. Affirming our own worth and operating from that place in life may not always get us to a specific end, but wherever we end up, we're okay. Simeon may not have gotten everything he wanted in Jerusalem, but he was open to receiving from a stranger he met on the road. It was because Simeon didn't assess his self-worth by what society said about people like him. That's why he was able to reach his goal. I like something I read by Zora Neale Hurston. It said, sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it doesn't make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can anybody deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference of difference. Because Simeon was so secure in himself, he was also open to learning something from someone who was not like him, someone who we would refer to as a stranger. We live in a world made up of strangers. As of 2 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday, there were 7,862,824,190 people in the world, and all of those people were not you. You only know and will ever know a small amount of these people. Think of all those different backgrounds and all those different ways of life, all those different life stories. So many people who know things that you don't know. One of the best ways to expand, or to grow is to open up to someone who is different from you. And many of us don't do that. That's why our country and our world is so fragmented. We live in our own little silo and do not interact with people who are also in their own little silo. That's why I was so troubled when I read that there are some people who are upset with the Biden administration for wanting to expose and respond to systemic racism and the reality and the impact of slavery. Then there's that movement to enact laws that make life dangerous and difficult for trans youth. And the states like most recently Florida, who followed Georgia, who are doing things they can do to control the vote. There are people who are living in silos and trying to shore up societal norms that work well for only a part of the citizens of this country and of this world. But the text for today shows us that Simeon was able to gain an understanding of his new faith because Philip and Simeon both were able to look beyond their ethnic, racial, and cultural differences to connect with someone who's different from them. What I like about the story is both people made that choice and actually followed through. Unfortunately, too frequently, it's the person with the least perceived power who has to take the risk to reach out to the other. That's why it's often important to form coalitions to work towards substantive change. We often have to meet at a bigger table with more people involved to have a real dialogue. But not just that, though. We can even meet at our smaller tables, connect with a coworker or a classmate or somebody you typically would not have a conversation with. Or at other times, recognize when we've been given an opportunity to grow, even while we're in the midst of that growth. I may have told you the story before about when I had to travel on business to Louisiana. And I went to a factory down there and was supposed to go back the next day. But the night that I had to spend the night there, when I went down to my car in the morning, there were little leaflets and flyers that were put out by the KKK about a rally that was going to take place in that area. And I'd never seen anything like that, didn't want to see it. All I wanted to do was get the heck away from Shreveport, Louisiana. And so I went to the factory early in the morning, got my work done, and went to the airport to try to get the first flight I could get back to New Jersey. And the strange thing that happened when I got to the airport was they told me that the only flight I could get back to New Jersey within the next day was for me to get on a plane in the next 15 minutes. Well, at that time, I didn't like flying. And the only way I could fly was by taking a tranquilizer. My tranquilizer took about 30 minutes to work. And they told me I had to be on the plane in 15 minutes. I went walking down to the jetway, I decided I was going to get on the plane. When I went to walk to the plane, they were dragging a man off of the plane who was having like a nervous breakdown or something. So I really didn't want to get on then. But I got on the plane anyway, because I thought about KKK, get on the plane. What am I going to do? I got on the plane. So I got on the plane and, I was taking the tranquilizer because I was afraid of flying. I had to fly, but, I was nervous. So I got on the plane and I sat in my seat and there was a little white boy sitting next to me. He must have been about 9 or 10 years old. And I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, "Ma'am, this is my first time flying and I'm scared." I looked at him and I'm like, "Why, God? Why am I sitting next to him?" But instead of me freaking out, I told him, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay." And as the plane started going down the runway, it was a little bumpy. And so he was scared. And I said, it's all right. I said, it's going to feel a little funny in a couple of minutes because it's going to be the plane taking off. And you'll feel a little pressure that feels like it's pushing you back, but you'll be okay. Then we got up in the air and we hit some rough air and he was afraid and he grabbed my hand, he grabbed my arm really. And he said, I'm really scared now. I said, there's nothing to be afraid of. That's air pockets. It's like speed bumps on the road. If you've been there, you've seen that before. It's the same thing. And then I've talked him through the whole flight until we got to Houston, where I got my connection back to New Jersey. But the interesting thing was, everything that I explained to that little boy was already in me, but I was always too afraid to know it. But it took an experience of being with a little white boy that I would not have chosen to sit next to. And it took that experience to bring out of me more than I knew about myself. And that's how life is. You know, sometimes if we're open to it, life will teach us that lessons that may not be about race, it may be about something else, but it can teach us that difference makes a difference. He was different than me, younger than me, a different race than me. But yet, that little boy brought out something in me that my psychiatrist couldn't bring out, my psychologist couldn't bring out. The medication just kind of helped me to avoid, but I was able to grow through that experience with somebody who was so much not like me. We have to be open to the lessons of life because they show up all the time. Walter Mosley said, "We are not trapped or locked up in these bones. No, we are free to change, and love changes us. And if we can love another, we can break open the sky." Something in me loved that little boy enough to open up to him. And that opened up something in me. And love makes a difference. In the story of Simeon and Philip, the text says it was the Spirit, God's presence, that directed them to connect. The Spirit told Philip which road to take, and then the Spirit told Philip to go up to Simeon's chariot. The text doesn't say it, but it's probably true that the Spirit led Simeon to invite Philip to sit down. We could all learn to be a little bit more open to the Spirit as we navigate through life. It not only guides us, it helps us to connect with the spirit of others. I've heard and I've witnessed that children and animals can sense when somebody has a contrary spirit, and they can typically tell when they're loved. But as we get older, most of us lose that ability because we lose our relationship with ourselves. Some of us never spend any quiet time when we get to hear our own spirit. We think we're only guided by our intellect. Well, I consider myself a pretty smart person, but I'm smart enough to know that my mind is not the only thing at work in my life. Some of my quiet time is spent doing what I call spiritual forensics. You know, forensics, the scientific analysis of physical evidence. Well, spiritual forensics is the analysis of actual occurrences. It's looking back, it's going back and looking to see what was really happening. What really did I learn? What really was going on? Like how missing that plane led me to flying with that little boy. Like how working with an Indian-led consulting firm with Indian management when I was at Coca-Cola, when that was the only job I could find, that led me to get over the bias I had towards Indian people. Or like how pastoring a church that welcomed everybody, where I met transgender parishioners, helped me to understand how the world was through their eyes. There have been so many lessons and so many relationships that have helped form the person who I am today. And many of those things were not orchestrated by me. I believe they were led by the Spirit. I read somewhere the Spirit can only communicate with us in our current level of understanding. Our spiritual habits determine what that level will be. Get ahead of the game. Get in tune with your spiritual self. Spend some time in prayer and in meditation, those places, whatever it is that helps you get in touch with what's going on in your own soul. Intentionally connect with the Spirit of God and then connect with that same spirit in others. Like Simeon in our story, Someone who is not like you may have the answer you need for the next phase of your life. They may be the part of your world that can open the door to the changes you seek. We all need coalitions. You know, as powers and systems try to work against us to disenfranchise, to marginalize, to exclude, we're going to need to come together as groups, a strong group of people, and stand together and speak together and vote and do what we can do together for equality and justice. You know, I'm glad today to be able to recognize that I don't have to have all of the answers. I don't even know all of the questions, but I share a world with billions of other people. And I have sense enough to know that one or a group of those people might be able to help me along my way. We don't know who that might be. And unless we take a risk to reach out and be open, unless we're able to get beyond our fears and our prejudice and allow ourselves to connect with the other, we're never going to be everything that we can be. If we're open and we're prayerful, we may learn the difference that difference can make. Thank you for listening.